Before the video begins, I want to give a huge thanks to our channel members, Erokuro and Glitched Space. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. If you want early access to videos or special access to custom-made channel emojis featuring my AU Sans and Papyrus, or a special little icon next to your name showing that you're a member, please consider becoming a member. Alright, on to the video. Desperation. A state of despair, typically one which results in rash or extreme behavior. Dusttale. If you've been in the Undertale fandom for any amount of time, I bet you would have come across this hooded up, edgy, dusty Sans at some point. Most probably in the very popular bad boy group, the Bad Sanses, made up of Horror Sans, Something New Sans, aka Killer Sans, and sometimes not really Error Sans and Cross, and the group being led by the big bad Nightmare Sans. And disclaimer, I mean this all purely from the fanon view, and not saying that they're all canonically approved to be in the group by the creators, okay? The group is a pretty big part of the fandom, and of course that means the individual Sanses in it are a pretty big part of the fandom too. We'll eventually tackle all the members in it individually, but today the spotlight is going to be on this specific out for blood, or maybe out for dust, Sans. And like with my previous videos, I'm going to try to limit what I talk about only to being what the creators have said. So no fan games, no fan comics, no... Was he an Underverse? No? Good, because I was not going to tackle that anyway. And well, his creator does say some things about him, Sans and other AU Sanses interacting, but we'll get to that later, so stay tuned for that. As always, please use the timestamps if there's a specific section you'd like to view. Now, let's get into it. Starting with his creators. On the Ask Dusttale blog on Tumblr, the person who handles the blog makes it very clear that there are 3 creators behind the AU's creation, but 2 of them didn't want to make themselves known, so we only really have information on the one that handles the blog, being Calvateyla. I think I'm saying that right. But when they were asked how people should credit the creators when they make Dusttale related fanworks, Calva had said that we should just either credit the blog itself or the AU's Twitter page, so I guess I'll just refer to the creators as just like Ask Dusttale or the Dusttale creators, unless it has to do with Calva themselves specifically. Anyway, Dusttale saw its beginning on a South Korean internet forum called DC Inside, specifically in its Undertale gallery section. Also, bear with me on this section, cause as you can guess, this was all in Korean, so I had to use a lot of Google Translate for this, and I have no idea how this site works. So, on the Ask blog, they had explained how exactly Dusttale came to be, and had said in one of their posts, someone had said, "I want to see Sans killing others." Another person drew it out and added, "This Sans killed others to prevent the human from the G route," or in other words, the genocide route. Another one was fascinated by him and added more framework to it. As in his name, his appearance, the AU name, Phantom Papyrus. And another one wrote fanfiction and added more details, like the nightmares he has, the guilt he has, the hallucinations, you get it. And on the DC Inside site, a post compiling links about Dusttale had shown that the original post, I think it's a screenshot of a post, showing someone saying that they wanted to see a Sans that kills. And while I have no idea when that post was uploaded, on February 10th, 2016 is when the official first post for Dusttale was made, with a prototype version of this AU. Uploaded by user Curtis, I think is how these say their name. It is an art of Sans brutally ending the player as they were reaching for the mercy button, and the caption beneath it reads, "As Sans becomes more and more unaffected by resetting and is reset dozens of times, he becomes more and more insane. Now the story is about him killing everyone, including Papyrus, to make it impossible to play the game." In another post by them just an hour later was another artwork of the Sans. The caption for this one reading, "During the battle with Flowey, he was unable to gain the power to save or load due to a strange power, but then he became unaffected by resets. He became exhausted from living alone in a world that is reset and reset forever, and was filled with anger at players who keep resetting out of curiosity. He kills everyone so you can't progress in the game, and then he confronts you as soon as you start playing, making it impossible to play the game." Another post posted a few hours later, which Calva had included in the Tumblr post talking about the origin of Dusttale, was posted by another user who I could only assume was one of the other creators, showing more Sans art, but this time with his iconic dust-covered look. The caption for this one reads, "As the player feels the repetitive resets, they become unaffected by the resets. At the end of the annihilation, or which I'm going to assume is supposed to translate to genocide, he realizes he cannot defeat the player even if he blocks them. Killing monsters to increase your own strength equals more love. Since everyone will die in the end if the player starts killing them anyway, he thinks it's better if he sacrificed the few to save the many. And as he starts to level up like that, he starts to distance himself, and things start to get weird because you keep resetting. He gradually loses his purpose and it starts to turn into genocide rather than a few sacrifices. The setting is that the massacre that started to protect the world ends up destroying the world regardless of the player. Since the other monsters in the underground are affected by the resets, naturally no one understands Sans. There was also a conflict with Papyrus during this process. If you were to call him Genocide Sans, it would overlap with the genocide route, Sans. So his name has been changed to Murder Sans. And the AU name is called Dusttale. Sans' clothes are characterized by a lot of dust. And thus, the name Dusttale and Murder Sans has been established. Which, yes, his official name is Murder Sans, not Dust Sans. At first, the creators had been pretty adamant on people calling him Murder Sans and not Dust Sans, but after realizing how much the non-Korean fandom preferred calling him Dust, they eventually relented and said it's fine to just call him Dust, since they realized a little too late that Murder Sans isn't really grammatically correct when translated into English, and they couldn't change the name now since it's already caught on as Murder Sans in the Korean fandom. I have no idea what YouTube would do if I kept repeating murder over and over, so we'll be safe and just call him Dust or Dust Sans when it's needed. Anyway, Dusttale gained a lot of popularity in the Korean fandom with more artwork from the creators and fans circulating the fandom space. And eventually, Dust Sans would make his way into the English fandom when Calva created the Dusttale Twitter page in March 2016, and then a couple of months later, the Ask Dusttale Tumblr blog in May 2016. The first post on the blog was posted on May 13th, and would later be translated to English on May 25th thanks to a translation blog. The post reads, "Of course Sans tried to stop the genocide by all means. Mercy, ever laughed at. Judgment, of no avail. Fighting, never to be won. Nothing helps. Throughout hundreds of genocides and resets, one day he gets determination to remember what happened, to kill them, to stop them. He plans to just make them tired from dying, like he had in the final corridor, but beyond the resets, with his newly found determination. The human soul was too powerful for a 1 LV monster, so he decides to sacrifice other monsters to get love himself for a greater good. He feels heavily guilty and dreams horrible nightmares of them. However, as the killing goes on, both the initial good intention and sense of guilt fades away, and he becomes a mindless killer himself. At that point, stopping the human becomes the only thing that matters to him. The others would be reset anyway. His brother is the last monster he would kill, but he does end up killing him as well, thinking it would be less painful to be killed by him than by the human. This is his final mental breakdown, after which he turns insane and is haunted by the phantom of Papyrus. Dusttale Sands is usually called Murder Sands or Moose Sands. His clothes are covered with the dust of those he's killed, and he puts his hood up to keep the dust out of his face. His left pupil is cyan encircled by red, and the right one is only red, which stands for the fact that he's lost the yellow of justice but gained the red of determination. He frequently chatters with the phantom Papyrus, which for others seems like he's just talking to himself. To him, the phantom is a floating bust of his brother with red eyes and the red scarf. He says, "We're gonna have a mad time" to the human when he challenges them. He loves to kill the human, especially when it's cunning or cruel. This AU has about 3 authors, who gradually built the character in a Korean Undertale forum, Undertale Gallery. And that's the basic laydown of what you need to know about Dusttale. Player that keeps resetting and continuously doing genocide runs, and by some glitch, Sans gains enough determination to remember them and tries to stop them, but as they continue happening, he turns to trying to stop the player the only way he can think of: lost. Killing the other monsters to get more LV so he can become strong enough to kill the human. Well, hope you enjoyed the video. And okay, no, I'm just kidding. The premise is set, but we have a ton of information from the Ask blog about what exactly led to his descent into madness and what happens during and after it, and a few hypotheticals, so we'll be going over all of that in order. Beginning with the beginning, the player. The Ask blog made it very clear that the human isn't Frisk or Kara, but just the human, a player. One of the posts clarified why, explained that Frisk was the icon of the pacifist route, but for Kara, who would be seen as the icon for the genocide route, when you finish the genocide route multiple times, like in the game, Kara will comment that you're wrecked with a perverted sense of sentimentality, referring to you, the player, separate from themselves. Therefore, the human is just the human, you. The human could best be described like your favorite YouTuber that keeps playing the game over and over and over, exploring different routes out of curiosity, feeling the urge to uncover every little secret that they can, particularly in the genocide route. Or maybe they're just doing it for fun. Probably both. The thing to note with the humans is that the number of resets that they've done aren't just a couple or 10 or even 20, but dozens and dozens and dozens of them, many of them being in the Geno route. It's during this endless bout of resets that an error occurs and Sand starts remembering what happened in all these resets. And eventually he couldn't just let this continue, being spurred on by this determination, and having to endure seeing the deaths of those he cares about, and then being killed himself over and over. He starts taking a more active role in trying to stop the human. At first, he tried everything he could possibly think of to put a stop to this, to keep everyone he loves and cares about safe from this endless torture, even if he was the only one remembering it. He tried being nice to the human, but that hadn't worked. He tried asking the other monsters for their cooperation to stop the human, to have them all fight the human at once, but they didn't really realize the true horror of what was happening, so every reset he had tried this method was met with the same result of nothing. He tried and he tried and he tried, and the number of resets kept stacking up more and more until eventually it began to reach close to the triple digits, and he decided he needed to go with a new idea. The human was getting this strong because of LV, so maybe he should get some LV so he would be able to stop them himself. If he just killed a few monsters, just enough to get enough power to stop the human, then it'll be an overall good for the majority, right? So that's what he did. It started with just one unfortunate monster in a dark, deserted area and waterfall, and, well, his LV increased, along with his stats, all of them going above that measly 1 across the board that they originally were. And so he decides to kill another, and another, and another. And when another reset occurred, he realized his LV would reset with it, so he had to gain as much LV as he could as soon as a reset happened before facing against the human. Sans killed a few more monsters, the number increasing and increasing, and of course it wasn't like he didn't feel immense guilt from doing this, but he continued rationalizing it as doing it for the greater good. When he realized the LV he was getting so far wasn't enough, he turned to the monsters he had been avoiding, those he felt closest to, and began targeting anyone he could. Undyne, Alphys, Toriel, Asgore, and eventually even his own brother wasn't safe. And if he didn't kill them, then the human would have, so this has to be a better outcome, right? It was a struggle, both externally and internally, of course. He had to kill the head of the royal guard and the king himself, and not to mention that Toriel was still a boss monster herself. Still, like any speedrunner would tell you, if you play a game enough times, it'll start becoming easier to beat because you start recognizing the patterns behind the different battles you're doing, the different paths you're going down. You'd learn more about them, their interests, their history, their relationships, their weaknesses, everything that would make it easier to kill them as quickly as he could. But even then, he would apologize immensely to them in the beginning. After a while, he'd start seeing all these monsters less and less like their present selves and like some past versions of themselves, like some sort of walking corpses. Or at least it'll be like looking at his own past. People being clueless and unchanging as he keeps having to change to adapt to this never-ending nightmare. Maybe that distance helps him fulfill this twisted duty he put on himself easier. With each reset, his very morals began to shift. His stance slowly shifted from "I'll kill the few to save the many" from the human to "I need to stop the human at any cost, and it's better that the others die at my hand than at the humans," which would lead to an all-out massacre of the entire underground with every reset at Sans' hand. As most of us know, the Yellow Soul stands for the soul trait of justice, thanks to the ball game, and in this AU that correlates with the yellow flashes that Sans' eye does along with the cyan. As he kills more and more, the yellow of his eye slowly begins to fade, replaced with a bright red of determination. His determination to stop the human literally begins to fill him with actual determination. Or perhaps that initial glitch had gotten that determination into him, enough to make him start remembering and actually want to actively stop the human, but not enough to save and load himself. Or maybe there's another reason he started to gain determination. That one was kind of left up to us to decide. Regardless, eventually the yellow of justice in his eyes is replaced with this twisted determination. Stop the human at all costs. He doesn't just stop at taking out everyone in the underground to get as much LV as possible before the human can. He starts attacking the human at any chance he can, he began trying to use traps so they would be caught off guard. And maybe someone should tell Sans that new outcomes like this only draw curious gamers into games more and more. Eventually, his mental state begins to deteriorate even more than it had been before. He begins to start hearing voices, the voices of all his friends he's killed, and eventually it leads to full-on hallucinations, the most prominent being his brother. Seeing Papyrus's head and hands floating near him, talking to him, berating him, blaming him for killing them all, but also pressuring him to keep killing, keeping track of the kills he still has left before he's killed everyone, almost like his very own narrator. Sans had at first been disturbed by his presence, but eventually he just accepts it, even listening to him like he would his actual brother, talking to him about things he would with the actual Papyrus, even if a part of him knows that this isn't the real Papyrus. He chooses to believe that Phantom Papyrus is, or he wouldn't be able to cope with it. And no matter how much this Papyrus haunts him, he is still just a hallucination. I'd like to think it's Sans' conscience taking the form of the most important person to him as a form of self-punishment for what he's doing. Whether Phantom Papyrus remains with Sans 24/7 after his appearance or only appears after Sans has killed the real Papyrus during a specific timeline is also up for you to believe or choose to believe, or you get it. Eventually, the only thing that Sans could focus on was stopping the human. When a reset happens, he'd immediately take out everyone else to get as much possible XP, so the human wouldn't get any. He'd plan out how he'd be able to catch the human off guard best and as soon as possible, even that being as soon as they leave the ruins, and he'd even be willing to run away in the middle of a fight if he was close to death, so he could heal and go right back to fighting the human as soon as he was back to full strength. He'd even figure out where the save points would most likely be by observing the areas the humans seem to get determination from most, and making it so they couldn't get determination from them anymore, by either destroying the area or killing them in a particularly terrible way repeatedly near it, so it couldn't be a place the human could feel determined at. But no matter what he does, his determination would never be able to match that of a human, so he'd never be able to take control of the saves or load or reset functions. And if he killed them, he'd simply wait until either the next reset happened or nothing. Sans and the human would just be stuck in an endless loop at this point. Even if the human did decide to switch to being a pacifist, Sans would have zero trust in what they would do, so would continue with his own genocide as soon as a reset happens to take them down. And in a true pacifist route, even Flowey's memory gets completely wiped, and Sans doesn't want to risk losing all his memories, so he doesn't want to chance taking the true pacifist route. If they had tried offering a truce, Sans would never truly accept it, either immediately rejecting it from his distrust of them and to mirror all the times he had tried peacefully stopping them during the many resets of the past but was rejected by them, or pretend to actually accept it, the truce, and eventually backstab them. Sans would never be able to return to being the Sans that he used to be before this whole disaster began. And Sans begins to realize that he starts looking forward to the human coming. He'd actually start missing the human if they didn't appear for too long. Not from affection or anything, but because he'd literally have nothing else to do otherwise. Not just that, he begins to feel a slight enjoyment from the act of leveling up to prepare for the human. If the human stops coming, then he would have achieved his goal of stopping them, but then he'd have no goals left. He hates killing all the other monsters, but at the same time, he doesn't. He enjoys it and he hates himself for enjoying it. He hates himself for all that he's done, and he doesn't like the past him, but he wants to go back, but even if he had the chance to go back, he wouldn't accept it. About a walking contradiction. Even if the human did decide to leave this game with one more reset, Sans would have already taken everyone else down before he could realize the human wasn't coming back, so he'd just be left in a dusty wasteland that is now the underground, simply waiting indefinitely for the human to return. He still wouldn't be able to reset even if the human isn't here. He'd simply do what he's always done when the human hasn't reset yet. Wait for the human, read some books, wait for the human, patrol the underground, wait for the human, talk with Phantom Papyrus, wait for the human, take a nap, wait for the human, drink, wait for the human. You get it. And also he wouldn't end his own life since he feels he has to continue doing this. His guilt driving him forward to take responsibility for his actions. And even if the determination in monsters isn't as strong as humans, and he did decide to give up, Dusttale had said he'd still fulfill his responsibilities regardless. Plus, he wouldn't think he deserved something as peaceful as an end like that. So, what happens afterwards? After he kills the human and they just don't return? Maybe the underground would collapse as a result of the player deleting the game for good. Maybe Sans would simply just wither away from old age from waiting so long, or maybe he might even change his mind and meet his end the same way all the other monsters had, at his own hand. Who's to say? The creators chose to leave that up to our imagination. Then you might be asking, is this just how Dusttale is doomed to last forever? Just some sick genocide loop? Well, there is one way to break the cycle, which I had mentioned before. The very thing Dust was right to be wary of when it came to a true pacifist run. A complete wipe of the game. The player would have to delete the game entirely for this to truly end. However, would a player that's played this game hundreds of times like this and been rewarded with all these new surprises courtesy of Sans really want to delete the game? I personally doubt that. But at least there's a way to truly save Dust from this eternal torment, if the player chooses to. And you might be thinking, he kind of seems like a hypocrite, wanting to save the monsters from being killed, but then he ends up killing all of them anyway. Probably even more monsters than the human would have, since he has access to places the human doesn't, and it's not like he doesn't realize that himself. If someone were to tell him that he was just like the human, he'd say that he knows that well. And what's the saying? You have become the very thing you swore to destroy. I didn't know how to slide this in naturally, but Sans does eventually start speculating that he must be in some kind of game, or at least this whole situation feels like one. And he also eventually starts calling the human not just human, but also the player. And to add another layer to not just seeing this as a game and the separate fact of slowly beginning to enjoy this, there are moments, under the weight of his responsibility, he sees this as some kind of PvP game against the player, which that's not. And the thing I find most interesting about Sans is that even if he was given the choice to escape the cycle, he would choose just not to. Not even just going back in time, but if he was literally given the choice of being removed from the Dusttale universe, it's confirmed that he would choose not to take it. And even if he was taken out of it, he'd do anything he can to return to it. Even if he did leave his AU, his attitude, the whole killing thing, wouldn't be something he'd do outside of it. His sole purpose now is stopping that specific human in Dusttale, so any other AU is of very little interest to him. Hell, he wouldn't even go on a human murder spree if he did end up in an alternate universe where the monsters were on the surface with humans. He wouldn't think the humans are good by any means, but he just wouldn't see a point in killing them or anyone else. He only really has a grudge against that one specific human in his underground. And since he only needs the XP of his own universe, getting XP outside of it is pointless in his mind, so it just wouldn't be worth the effort. And also, other AUs aren't his jurisdiction, so if he was outside of the Dusttale universe and stuck in another, he'd just sit tight and do nothing, since he has no goal outside of his AU if there's no way for him to return to it. It's another story if the player somehow managed to hack Dusttale to end up at the end of the true pacifist route and got everyone to the surface. He'd immediately put a stop to that ending and immediately wipe out everyone so the player wouldn't get the ending that they wanted. Also, slight tangent from the whole universe hopping thing, if, say, a different human were to fall instead of the player, like maybe an adult, as someone had used it as an example, Dust would actually pause and observe them before outright just attacking them off the bat. If they reminded him a little too much of the original player, that's when he'd get them. So even if he is a little off his rocker, he still has some sense to not indiscriminately tear down anything in his path. Kind of. Anyway, returning to the multiverse thing, while the Ask Dusttale blog had been very adamant on not answering anything related to AUs before, during the early to mid dates of March 2021, they had a change of heart and decided they would start answering asks that had to do with Dusttale and other AUs, and people really went all out on the questions on those during that time period. While I would have preferred to stick to just talking about Dusttale related information, since one of the creators is actually answering these, I don't think there's any harm in tackling a few of them, right? And before we get into this, the creator that runs the blog had made a post on June 6th, 2021 saying that it had been a long time since they lost contact with the other creators and since the blog was made. That Dusttale is just a very basic structure of an AU that they were filling with their own interpretation, so people shouldn't take their thoughts as completely correct, but to only use their answers as a guide. So please bear in mind for everything I've said showing the responses. While I'm personally taking their word closer to being the law of this AU, since, they were one of the people that made it, I just thought it was important to say that that isn't really what they intended. Now, before any specific individual takes in terms of AUs, Dust's general views on any other alternates of himself would depend on one thing above anything else: their opinion on the human. If they trust the human, he would hate them, but would also feel jealous of the happiness that they have that he doesn't. If they're also doubtful and wary of the human, then he'd think well of them, but also feel sorry for them since he wouldn't want them to be in the same situation that he's in. If, say, someone from another AU were to come to Dusttale and offer to help him to stop the human and keep him company, then he'd accept it, but he wouldn't truly feel at peace with it, considering he'd still have a guilty conscience over his past actions. Now onto the big question. We now know Sans wouldn't want to actually harm anyone outside of his AU, so how exactly would he ever agree to being in a group like the Bad Sanses? Also, before we answer that, Us Dusttale had made a post saying that they were thankful for whoever decided to put Dust into the bad guys, into the big bads of the multiverse, so pretty obvious they have no real negative feelings on Dust being a bad Sans, even if it conflicts with his characterization. Okay, well, the only way Dust being in the Bad Sanses would work is if he was literally forced into being a part of it. Say if one day Dust managed to kill the human and they just stopped coming, and Nightmare were to appear and offer him a spot in the Bad Sanses. Dust would just flat out refuse. He sees him remaining in Dusttale as his punishment, that being in this underground where no one else remains, thanks to him, is, well, fitting, and would see no reason to want to accept Nightmare's offer. Besides, killing anyone outside his AU would just be meaningless to him. However, if he was forced out of his AU by Nightmare, he'd reluctantly cooperate with what he wanted so he could be returned to his AU, since he'd want to go back any way possible. As for Dust's opinion on the other bad senses, he would despise Killer for actually joining forces with a human in something new, something he just can't understand. Not like he'd outright attack him over it though, he'd just keep his distance from Killer, but would still throw hands if he had to. As for him and Horror Sans, Dust would see no reason to antagonize Horror, or could have a reason to dislike Dust since Dust had killed his own brother, and that would probably cause Horror to be wary of Dust. Still, out of the bad senses, Horror would be the one that Dust would have I'm saying this lightly, the best relationship with, since they had both went through a lot thanks to what the human had done in their underground. There were a lot of Dust and Geno Sans questions. They were abundant. Despite having similar goals of eliminating their human at almost any cost, it's the differences that would prevent the two of them from truly getting along. Dust wouldn't understand how Geno could accept any human's proposal, much less trust them again, and thinks that Geno is kind of an idiot. Though he would be able to see sense in having himself be sacrificed so his underground wouldn't have to deal with the human anymore, as long as no one else is sacrificed for that purpose, which... ironic, ain't it? As for Error, while Dust knows that he himself could be considered a glitch too, he wouldn't ever let Error erase his timeline since it's his timeline and he wouldn't want outside intervention, helpful or not. And Ask Dusttale had said out of all the Sanses, Error would be the one Dust Sans would hate most. If he takes his soul and restrains his freedom like he had with Swap Sans. That is, if he could. After all, the only reason he went to the drastic measures he had in his AU was so he wouldn't keep being the human's toy and be able to retain some semblance of his free will. Anyone who would take that away from him would be considered an enemy in his eyes. As for Dust's opinion on Cross, he'd hate him, only because he can understand him since he feels that they're of the same kind. Still, he would also still feel sorry for him. As for monsters in Dusttale-like universes, he wouldn't be interested in them since he wouldn't be interested in murderers. He wouldn't be interested in murderers like himself. But when it comes to Dust Belief Papyrus, he'd feel sorry for him since he'd never want his brother to become someone like him. Now for someone a little different. Call Frisk. Dust wouldn't actually hate them right off the bat for being a version of the human. He would observe them and conclude that they were a genuinely good person. And probably helps that they don't look that much like the human anymore. And if they had offered to give him a safe haven in the Omega timeline, he wouldn't accept it. He would be willing to let the other monsters in Dusttale go there to escape the human, but he wouldn't go with them himself since he doesn't think he deserves that happiness. Now onto another fact, which I guess is the fact section, but not really. Okay, anyway. The Dusttale creator behind the Ask Dusttale blog had actually written a 7-part fanfiction series about Dusttale on Archive of Our Own pretty early into its lifetime. But since it's written in Korean, I had to Google Translate it to read through it. And when people had asked if there was any canon story to the story, they had mentioned that this series was semi-canon, so it's probably the closest thing to an official story we're going to be getting for this AU. I'll be summarizing the fanfic here, so You can skip ahead if you'd rather not have to hear me summarize it. Or if you want to read it yourself, go ahead. Okay, so the first part is right after a reset happens, and Sans already has memories of the AUs at this point. He's already going on his genocidal sprees at this point. Sans decides to go to the ruined doors like he used to before the resets had happened and talk to the lady behind the door. It had started off like normal with light jokes between them, but then Sans broke down the door and took care of her before she had time to feel betrayed by him. The second had another reset happen, and despite it, there's still a mental fatigue Sans feels that can't seem to go away. He had been avoiding going to sleep because of the nightmares he's been having, but decides to try regardless. And wouldn't you know it, he ends up having a nightmare, where he sees white falling from the sky, but when he looks up, he sees that it's not just dust, but the body parts of the other monsters falling like snow, which startles him awake. He gives up on sleeping and goes back to his post, taking care of any monster that is in his path, and he ends up falling asleep again. Or so he thinks. During this moment of thinking that he's asleep, he ends up attacking Papyrus, his brother turning to dust before he could even realize what he had done. As he grieves, Phantom Papyrus appears before him and Sans is startled at first, but no matter how much he tries to run, it follows him, making it impossible for Sans to avoid his sins when a manifestation of them is literally haunting him. The third has Sans in another new timeline, and he decides to go to the lab. He sees Alphys and almost immediately attacks her with a bone attack, giving her a fatal wound. When she asks why he would do this to her, he tells her about the previous timeline he had been in, how she had hidden away the other monsters before he could reach them. He kept talking at her as she slowly turns to dust, and he promptly left without a hint of guilt. He goes to Waterfall and clears out all the monsters there, leaving the echo flowers to now echo the screams of help from the monsters instead of their wishes. Then he's confronted by Undyne, who had gone to the lab and then come to Waterfall and realized that he was the one behind all of this. Sans manages to get the upper hand and stab her with a bone attack, and when she asks why he was doing this, he simply says that it was necessary. Undyne had managed to fight him a little longer before Sans managed to win against her, leaving behind her dust. The fourth has the human deciding to try being a pacifist in this next run, with them leaving the ruins with their LV still at 1. When they do, they realize no one else is outside the ruins. Since they had started their genocide routes, things had started becoming unpredictable, with them constantly having to fend off bone attacks and everywhere they went being met with the dust of monsters and their save points being so badly damaged that they were unusable now. As they neared the bridge leading to Sans's outpost, the familiar sound of footsteps came from behind them, and there was Sans. But his clothes were free of dust. It seemed like things were back to normal. The human really did promise themselves that they wouldn't hurt anyone this time. They had felt an urge to take revenge against Sans for the times he had started being absolutely ruthless with them in the previous timelines, but I had a feeling that if they did, it would ruin the normalcy that they had now, so suppressed it. Everything continued like it should have before all this craziness had happened, and like the game was supposed to. They continued on to Snowden, got past Papyrus peacefully, and gone to Waterfall, where Sans was at his post and offered to go to Grillby's with them, which they agreed to. However, Sans didn't take them to Grillby's but to MTT Resort, and it was an absolute wreck. The fountain was smashed and spilling water everywhere, there were dents in the walls, and the only thing remaining from the monsters was just their dust. When the human looked to the hand Sans had in theirs, it was covered in dust. Sans told them he didn't think they were this stupid before attacking them with his bone attacks. The fifth, once again, another reset. Sans wasn't bothered by it, but instead he enjoyed the fact that he could start the slaughter once again, which he does. But as he's going about his business, Flowey appears, asking why he was still doing this like some sort of crazy murderer. Sans asks if Flowey had any right to criticize him and calls him Prince Dreamer, which catches Flowey off guard. Sans bursts out laughing and asks if Flowey thought he wouldn't know. Flowey realizes that Sans had probably killed him at some point and asks if Sans was sure he hadn't killed less people than Flowey had at this point and to stop pretending. Sans says he's only doing it to stop the human, while Flowey did it for curiosity's sake. Flowey tries defending himself since he isn't doing anything now, but Sans points out it's only because he doesn't have access to the power to save anymore. Sans asks if Flowey remembers how many times the human had killed him, and as he counts with his hands, it's more than he could possibly count on his hands. Flowey asks Sans for one more chance for no one else to be killed, to let everyone be freed. Sans simply says he'll meet him in front of the ruins. The two meet there, but Flowey sees Sans talking to Midair, and when he questions it, Sans says his brother is right there, which makes Flowey realize just how far Sans' mental state has fallen. Flowey decides to silently wait for the human to come as Sans continues to talk to what he thought was his brother. However, when Flowey hears the human behind the door, he tries reaching a leaf out towards Sans, which ends up with him being torn apart by him. Sans' anger boils over as he berates him, telling him that he had so many opportunities before for a happy ending that he had never took, and now Flowey was begging for them now. Like, who did he think he was? In the 6th, Washua is running away from Sans and tries hiding in a cluster of echo flowers, but it made no difference, with Sans finding him instantly. Washua said that his soul was defiled right before Sans took care of him. Sans simply moves on to Hotland. As he's making his way there through Waterfall, he talks to Phantom Papyrus, asking to take a break, but Phantom Papyrus asks if he's already tired and calls him lazy. As they walk through Waterfall, Sans sees an umbrella and picks it up. He reminisces about the past, when he'd hold an umbrella over Papyrus's head when it rained, since Papyrus didn't think he'd catch a cold since he was strong and always ran around without an umbrella. Then, one day, since he was always holding the umbrella over Papyrus and not himself, he ends up drenched from rain and gets a cold. It's from then on that Sans holds the umbrella for himself, and he can't remember the last time he held one up for Papyrus. Well, not like he can, since he can't reach Papyrus now. A drop of water runs down Sans' cheek as he decides the two of them should just wait a little longer before they continue. In the last released part, the human is walking through the core, which had been wrecked thanks to Sans having gone through it. They hear some screams and follow them, hoping to sneak attack Sans, but he managed to get a hold of their soul with blue magic and hold them in place as he pierces them with a bone attack. Sans mocks them, pointing out that their LV in the last few timelines hadn't had the chance to go over 6 thanks to him. He then aimed his attacks at the human, all of them ready to pierce them. The human tells him that if Sans has something to say, then he should say it. And Sans tells them that in the next reset, they shouldn't kill anyone and Sans wouldn't either. A win-win. The human is obviously doubtful at first, but Sans admits to being tired now. He continues and says he's done everything he could from boredom, that the human would understand that feeling, and that hasn't changed the fact that everyone just keeps dying over and over. That nothing has changed, only the killer had. He wants this to end. The human decides to agree and do one more reset, and Sans finishes them off with a blast from his Gaster Blaster. Then the timeline resets. The human had had fun with the new unknowns that Sans had brought after the countless generals, but even that had gotten tiring to the point of making them feel disgusted. and it wasn't any fun when they kept dying in ways out of their control so often. They were pretty sure they noticed Sans seeming pretty bored in the recent resets too. They continued on their journey without hurting anyone, being stopped by Flowey, who questioned them, actually listening to Sans and warning them that people don't change that easily. They then get stopped by Sans at the bridge, who is also still dustless, looking like he used to. As Papyrus came and they did their familiar banter as a human hid behind the lamp, Sans seemed genuinely happy, so the two continue this truce. Except as they continued their journey, they realized Sans wasn't in the spots he was supposed to be in. When they called Papyrus, they realized Sans was just spending time with him today. And every time they came across a spot Sans was supposed to be but wasn't, they'd call Papyrus and hear what the two of them were doing. First, they were simply watching TV together while eating Papyrus' spaghetti, then they were having a snowball fight and then making a snowman together, with Papyrus telling the human to come see the first proper snowman Sans had ever made. Finally, the Hall of Judgment. Sans was covered in white, but this time it was only snow, not dust, even letting the human examine his jacket to be sure. Sans praises them for not raising their LV and has nothing else to say to them, so says a simple "see you later" and disappears. The human continued on, knowing that once they all got to the surface, they'd be able to erase the memories of every monster. They'd be able to perform a true reset. They walked into Asgore's flower room and were momentarily blinded by the light there. Suddenly, a wind blew past them, and the sound of heavy iron landing on the floor echoed through the room. Then they heard Sans' voice, asking if he didn't say he'd meet them later. Asgore's cloak fluttered to the ground as Sans stood on a pile of dust. Sans thanks the human for letting him have fun with his brother again, then says they didn't do it for good intentions anyway, right? And that the person who betrays first in these kinds of situations always wins. Then a purple glow appears, and the end. On the topic of things the Ask Dusttale owner has written, they'd also written something pretty recently, if you classify the beginning of 2022 as recently at least. Basically, an unofficial ending for Dusttale, written in Korean, featuring Underfell Sans and Dusttale Sans becoming friends? Well, becoming something to each other. It starts by asking the question, who judges a judge? Then goes on to talk about how Sans is both a judge and a sinner, and that a part of him longs for someone who would be able to judge him, but there was no one in his underground who could. Then suddenly, a new passageway appears in the Dusttale universe, and curiosity leads him to going into it. He ends up in Underfell. Thanks to Underfell always having a scripted happy ending, the judge in this AU never has to worry about a human going on a crazy genocide route. Underfell Sans senses something is wrong and goes to where it is and finds Dust Sans, seeing his disgustingly high level of LV and seeing him covered in dust. It would have been a welcome meeting for Dust since he had gotten used to seeing no one else in his underground anymore, but of course Fel wouldn't just ignore a threat like this. So they fight, with Fel throwing the first attack to try either scare Dust Sans away or kill him in fear of Dust being a threat. While Dust had wanted someone to judge him, he couldn't actually let it happen. He still had his responsibilities after all. So the two go all out in fighting. Other monsters start gathering from the commotion, and Fel starts to realize Dust was actually making sure none of the attacks were hurting the other monsters. He stops fighting him and demands an explanation, but Dust makes his escape without explaining anything. After a while, Fel goes into Dusttale for reasons even he isn't really sure of. He sees the state of it, quiet, lonely, and dusty. He goes to Grillby and finds Dust there, wearing a bloody coat and injured. Fel tries to treat his wounds, but Dust refuses to let him since his wounds would disappear when the human resets, but Fel insists and treats them regardless. Val asks what kind of guy he is, and Dust confesses everything, waiting for his judgment, but it never comes. Instead, the two become friends. After lots of things happen between them, Dust asks Val to become his judge in case he goes completely mad, and Val reluctantly eventually agrees to do it. Then it happens. After many resets, Dust begins to become consumed by madness, forcing Fel to have to judge him. However, when he does, an error occurs on Dusttale that causes the timeline to collapse. Fel ends up banished back to Underfell since he didn't belong in Dusttale, and he wishes his friend a long overdue rest. However, the timeline is restored and Dusttale is returned to how it used to be, thanks to the humans wanting this to continue and the cycle repeats again. While Dust had forgotten everything that had happened between them, Fel still remembers and their relationship continues until Dust can finally find eternal, true rest. Which is a really bittersweet ending. When I had finished going through the Ask blog, I couldn't help thinking of the mindset where you feel like you have to do something even if it becomes detrimental for your health. I cannot for the life of me remember what it's called. When you're so stuck on something that you truly don't realize how bad it's gotten. I feel just really sorry for Sans that he was just forced into this mindset from feeling completely helpless in the situation he's stuck in. Anyway, onto the Dust trivia section for stuff I couldn't fit into the other parts of the video. Sans' biggest fear is no one understanding him, remembering him, or standing with him, as well as the fact that he would have to relive the same events over and over and over. It's no wonder he lost his mind eventually. And after covering the Dust Sans Fel Sans potential ending, it feels really heart-wrenching that he does have someone that will always remember him now, but he can't always remember them. Ironic, ain't it? The irony of Sans thinking that the monsters would be better off taken care of by him rather than the human is that if the monsters did start remembering resets, then they'd remember Sans recklessly taking them out more than the human doing whatever they wanted with them. If by some miracle there was some monsters that escaped his initial underground cleansing and after he had already 86'd the human and they hadn't reset yet, depending on his sanity levels, Sans would actually let those monsters live since loneliness isn't exactly a pleasant feeling. Now, how these monsters would react to seeing the monster that wiped out all their friends and family that weren't lucky enough to make it to their secret hideout is another story. Sans can still use karma, it'll just be weaker. He is still a judge after all, and his own karma wouldn't hurt him unless he somehow attacked himself or another Sans attacked him. Sans would never use the human souls. First, because Asgore hid them pretty well enough that not even Flowey was able to find them during all his resets, so Sans wouldn't be able to either. Second, because he has no interest in the power, he just wants to stop the human. Dust's LV when he fights the human isn't always the same, but the highest he usually gets to seems to either be 19 or 20. But since he can get to more monsters than the human can, he could potentially also get more XP than the human would be able to. Since the human had done lots of different routes, they would have actually gone down a pacifist route at some point that Sans could remember, but his memories of being on the surface feel like a daydream now. If the human were to be replaced with good old regular Frisk again, Sans would still murder them since he only feels murderous intent toward any human in Dusttale. Sans doesn't change out of his dusty clothes since who does he need to stay clean for? It'll all just reset anyway. Sans is still Sans despite all of this. He still likes ketchup, he still wears the same clothes as the original Sans does, even if they're a little bit more dusty. He doesn't wear Papyrus' scarf, which I'm I've heard is a thing that some people do. He just keeps the scarf somewhere safe, out of the human's reach. He still likes puns, even if they're darker now. He still uses the same attacks he had before. They're just more difficult and harder to predict. So like no purple bones or absorbing the powers of the other monsters that he's killed or anything like that, which people think he does apparently. His eyes are usually still white like Sans's are. They only turn red and blue during combat or when he's having trouble controlling his emotions, especially when he's angry or unstable. Sans does in fact have an eye flame for coolness factor. Sans has used the knife a couple of times just to try it out, but went back to using his regular magic attacks. Despite wanting to have had the other monsters help him in the beginning, if another monster were to kill the human now, he'd see it as them taking over his responsibility and feel angry about it. Sans wears his hood up to keep the dust out of his face, but the meta original reason was inspired by if you killed Papyrus in a neutral run and rocked up with Chiron, instead of Sans handing out toilet paper tickets, he'd simply be a hooded figure watching from the distance, and that's what inspired Dust's original look. Sans can kill ghosts with his magic, so not even Napstablook is safe. Sans wouldn't go out of his way to kill any animals though, since he wouldn't see it as necessary, but he wouldn't go out of his way to make his attacks avoid them either if they were in the way. When asked what Sans's view on the words family, friendship, and love were, the answer was Papyrus for family, sorry for friendship, and what I need for love. Sans would still pay for things he takes from ownerless shops. When he had first started gaining LV, he used to go through the monster ritual of spreading their dust on their loved things, but eventually stopped, only expressing his condolences to show that he still had respect for the deceased. His favorite type of alcohol is vodka because it's strong. His favorite book genres are science fiction and fantasy. In terms of his romantic and sexual preferences, the response, which was preceded with not one, but two sighs, was that it's just the same as classic Sans's. If Sans were to finally stop the human, the first thing he'd say is, "What should I do now, Pap?" Thank you for everyone that submitted fan art. I'll just have them on the screen as we go into the outro. Anyway, shocker! Another AU that had more depth to it than I thought compared to what I've seen from the fandom. I can definitely see why the creators were so initially against having anyone roleplay as Dust or shipping him with anyone to avoid twisting up his personality and concept until way after the AU had gotten a very strong foundation in the fandom, which, role-playing as Dust or shipping him with other characters romantically was something the creators didn't want anyone doing until they decided to give the open go-ahead in 2020, a whole 4 years after his creation. Like I said before, I just feel sorry for Dust Sans. To anyone that had seen my False Swap Gold video, I had said that reading the novel that inspired that AU 1984 had literally made me feel claustrophobic, and I get that same sense from how helpless Sans is in this one. While I think resorting to genocide himself is really wild, he was literally backed into a corner thanks to a being that he has no control over, with every other option he tried going with ending up in failure. At the very least, I'm glad the creators decided to give him one potential kind of happy ending. Anyway, thanks for watching the video. Please like if you liked it. Please subscribe if you want to see more. Please comment if you have anything to say, and I'll be seeing you in the next one. Take care and Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and just Happy Holidays. I feel like I'm committing some kind of holiday sin by posting this video during the festive season, actually.